Hello everyone. Tonight we won't panic. No need to grab garlic or onions or your grandmother's talisman carved from an unlucky goat hoof. Tonight we'll just tiptoe, very quietly, through the darkest corners of medieval Europe, into the soft hush of torchlight, into the narrow cobblestone alleys that smell faintly of soup, smoke, and superstition. This is not a story about heroic knights or grand cathedrals. This is a story about fear, sneezes, and what it feels like to live in a world that doesn't quite know what germs are, but is absolutely sure that something very bad is happening. Before we start, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you like this kind of content. Your support truly means a lot to me. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. I'm genuinely interested in knowing who is joining us from around the world. You may have heard of the Black Death, the plague that swept through Europe like an unwelcome guest with very poor manners. Yes, it killed millions. Yes, it changed history. But before the black-robed doctors arrived with their bird masks stuffed full of herbs, and long before the last unlucky rat took its final infected breath, people lived their ordinary, messy, hopeful lives. And that's where we begin. Let's imagine, for a moment, a small town in France, or perhaps in Italy, maybe even somewhere in England, where the bread is bland and the mud is persistent. It's the mid-14th century. You're surrounded by wooden houses with thatched roofs, narrow streets with no drainage, and neighbours who consider bathing a suspicious hobby. You're wearing clothes you probably haven't changed in weeks. Your boots are made from something that was once alive, but no longer smells like it should. And you're always just a little bit itchy. The air smells of firewood, sweat, livestock, and yesterday's soup, which is probably still today's soup. Children run barefoot. Chickens wander freely, and someone's always hammering something nearby. Your life isn't luxurious, but it's familiar, and up until now, it's the only life you've ever known. You work, you sleep, you eat bread, you argue with the baker, you pay taxes more than you should. You go to church, partly because it's expected, and partly because it's warm inside. You hear stories from travelers and wonder if dragons are real. You know the noble family by name, though they do not know yours. You have neighbours you trust, neighbours you don't, and probably one old woman everyone is quietly a little afraid of. Life isn't easy. Not by modern standards, not even close. Your teeth hurt, your back aches, and you still have to wake up and tend to your animals, if you're lucky enough to have animals. Your world is small, but it's yours. Now, something begins to shift, but it's not dramatic at first. No comets, no booming voices from the heavens, no dramatic soundtrack in the background. Just a whisper, a rumour. A ship arrived at port last week and people started coughing. A merchant came through town and didn't make it back out. Someone's cousin died in their sleep. Unusual, sure, but not yet terrifying. And then you hear it again. From someone else this time. A fever, a swelling, a sudden terrible end. You try to ignore it. Maybe it's just the flu. Maybe it's punishment for something. Maybe it's just a coincidence. You don't know what bacteria are. You don't know about fleas or infected rats, or how ships have become floating petri dishes. You don't know that the thing creeping its way across your continent has already carved through cities, through families, through entire towns. All you know is that something is wrong, and it's getting closer. That's the world we're stepping into tonight. Not the clean, carefully labeled version in your old school textbook. This isn't about memorizing death tolls or tracing arrows on a map. This is about what it felt like to wake up one morning and realize the world is changing. Not with a bang, but with a cough. It's the sound of bells tolling far too often. The sight of doors marked with chalk. The taste of fear in your daily bread. It's the quiet way neighbors stop speaking to each other. It's the priest who suddenly stops showing up to mass. It's the lingering question in the back of your mind. Will I be next? We'll explore what people did, what they believed, and how they coped. From the wealthy merchant who thought fleeing to his country estate would solve everything, to the peasant who could no longer afford candles for the altar. From the doctors who guessed wrong, to the barbers who tried bloodletting just in case it helped. And of course we'll see the strange, sweet attempts at comfort. The herbs tucked into windowsills, the prayers whispered into cold nights, the songs sung to keep fear at bay. You'll meet the flagellants, who thought whipping themselves through the streets might convince God to call off the plague. You'll see the walls built to keep the sick out, and the carts used when those walls failed. It's a world full of misunderstandings, of desperate solutions, of well-meaning nonsense and quiet courage. A world where everything changed, but not all at once. A world that felt eerily slow, even as death moved fast. And through it all, we'll walk slowly, gently, quietly, because this is a story that doesn't need drama to be powerful. It only needs to be heard. So take a deep breath, maybe stuff a little lavender in your collar just to be safe. Let the fear stay behind. We're only visiting, and we won't touch anything. Let's begin with life before the plague arrived, because believe it or not, things weren't going all that well to begin with. Ready? Let's step into that dusty, drafty home of yours and meet the world as it was before the coughing started, before the plague ever reached a single port, long before any bell tolled for another lost soul or another chalk mark was drawn on a cottage door. Life in medieval Europe was already somewhat miserable. In fact, if you had wandered through the average village in, say, 1346, a good year to be slightly anxious, you would have found very few people stopping to smell the roses, because there were no roses, just manure, and maybe a goat that smelled like it had started fermenting. Let's set the scene. You're in a thatched roof cottage made of wood, wattle, daub, and ambition. It leaks, it creaks, and the floor is mostly just the earth, smoothed down over time by generations of feet, hooves, and spilled soup. You sleep on straw, which is shared with family members, a few friendly rodents, and, if you're lucky, a grumpy cat with a strong sense of personal space. The winters are cold, the summers are itchy, and the in-between seasons are mostly just wet. Rain doesn't wait for an invitation. It enters through your roof, drips onto your forehead in the middle of the night, and turns your floor into a kind of lumpy porridge. There's no insulation, unless you count hanging up your heaviest cloak on the wall and pretending it's helping. When you wake, there's work to be done. Always. You don't ask what day it is. You already know the answer. It's a work day. Every day is a work day. Fields need tending. Sheep need chasing. And something, somewhere, always needs mending. You rise before the sun, stretch your aching back, and shuffle out into a landscape that's part mud, part chore list. Your diet consists mainly of bread. More bread, onions, and an exciting fourth option: stale bread. Sometimes there's ale, which is mildly comforting and only occasionally full of floating things. Milk is for the young, meat is for the rich, and vegetables are for the ambitious. A balanced diet, in theory, means you have a crust in one hand and hope in the other. Now, let's add the fun parts. Famine had visited recently, actually more than once. The early 1300s were particularly generous with crop failures, flooding, and general let's ruin everything weather. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 left entire regions weak, hungry, and dependent on grains that sometimes arrived rotten or not at all. And while it technically ended, its effects lingered like a bad smell in a warm room. People weren't just hungry, they were chronically undernourished. Their bodies were already losing a battle they didn't even know had started. And then there's the feudal system, a wonderfully complex way of making sure that people with the least amount of money paid the most taxes. If you were a peasant, and statistically you probably were, you owed a portion of everything, your grain, your livestock, your time, to the local lord, the church, and sometimes a passing noble who just looked like he owned something. You worked the land but didn't own it. You paid rent for your tiny plot and still owed labor on someone else's field. It was like living on a treadmill that only ran uphill, and the treadmill yelled at you in Latin. The local lord might offer protection, but he also charged you for using the communal oven. That's right, baking your bread cost extra. Speaking of protection, crime was a thing. Not organized crime with fedoras and jazz, but the kind that involves someone sneaking into your chicken coop at night and stealing your best hen. Justice was inconsistent and occasionally involved trial by ordeal, where people were told to hold hot irons or walk through fire to prove their innocence. Innocent or not, you usually ended up with burns and a renewed interest in keeping a low profile. Cities, of course, weren't much better. Urban life promised more opportunity, but mostly delivered more people, more smells, and more suspicious puddles. Streets were narrow, drainage non-existent, and the air thick with the scent of fish, smoke, and regret. Markets bustled, but so did lice. You might find work as a craftsman, a merchant's assistant, or someone who shouts about cabbages. But the wages were low, and the risk of catching something unpronounceable was high. Bathing? Optional. Soap existed, but it was rough, expensive, and probably shared. Most people believed that water could carry disease, which, ironically, was sort of true, but not in the way they thought. So instead of scrubbing down, folks relied on linen undergarments to soak up sweat and changing them every so often. So often being defined as when the smell becomes a conversation topic. Public health measures included avoiding bad smells and blaming lepers. Disease was considered divine punishment or the result of corrupted air. Doctors, if consulted, might recommend balancing your humours by applying leeches, or suggest you chew cloves while staring at the moon. A few might even bleed you with a knife, just to let the evil out. So yes, medicine was more of a hobby than a science. And religion, deeply important. Comforting, yes, but also loaded with rules, fears, and the constant threat of hellfire. The church loomed over daily life, both spiritually and literally. Bells rang for every occasion: births, deaths, storms, bad harvests, questionable singing. You paid tithes, obeyed feast days, and hoped your priest was more literate than your cow. Saints were petitioned for everything from sore throats to stolen tools. And if something went wrong, someone probably blamed sin. The emotional climate of medieval Europe, then, was somewhere between resigned and lightly terrified. People believed deeply in fate, in divine will, in curses and blessings, and that someday, if they worked hard enough, their children might own slightly less ragged shoes. The sense of stability was an illusion, and people clung to it with both hands. Now imagine this fragile, muddled world, propped up by hard labour and hard bread, beginning to tremble. Whispers arriving from ports, a sickness from the east, a pestilence moving faster than understanding, a blackness that spreads not only through the body, but through the soul of a population that has already had quite enough. Thank you very much. No one is ready. No one knows what's coming. They only know that they're tired and sore and something is changing. So let's follow the ships now. Let's walk quietly into the port towns, where the rats are disembarking without passports and the fleas are already looking for their next ride. Let's drift forward into the moment when the Black Death first arrives, silently, invisibly, and very much unwelcome. It began, as all truly dreadful things tend to, with ships. The year was 1347. Europe, for all its dirt and debt, was not prepared for what the port of Messina in Sicily was about to welcome ashore. The ships arrived, their sails limp, and their decks quiet. Too quiet. Dock workers approached with the usual complaints about their backs and the weight of barrels, but soon noticed that these vessels were not just carrying goods, they were carrying corpses. These were Genoese trading ships, returning from the Crimean port of Caffa. At first glance, they looked no different from the usual Mediterranean vessels. Wooden, weather-beaten, full of odd smells and even odder sailors. But these ships bore a silence that clung like fog. Many on board were already dead. The few that remained were dying, covered in boils, groaning softly or not at all. Nobody knew what was going on. They just knew something was wrong. The city officials, bless them, did the most medievally bureaucratic thing possible. They let the ships dock, briefly panicked, and then told them to leave. But it was too late. Rats don't wait for invitations, and fleas don't respect quarantine. By the time the cargo was unloaded, the real cargo had already escaped. Rats scurried ashore, fleas hidden in their fur, and the plague tiptoed across Sicily like an uninvited guest determined to lick all the spoons. Now here's the important thing. No one had the slightest idea what was actually happening. You see, microbiology was not exactly trending in the 14th century. The idea of bacteria was centuries away. Germ theory didn't exist. And fleas, well, they were just part of life, like taxes, or that one neighbour who won't stop singing at sunrise. Instead, most people turned to the explanation that felt familiar and vaguely spiritual. Bad air. also known as miasma. The theory went like this. Foul-smelling air carried disease. It wafted in from swamps, waste heaps, or sinful neighborhoods, and entered your body when you breathed it in. Naturally, this led to some questionable strategies, like carrying posies, herbs, or even pressing sweet-smelling sponges to your nose. If you've ever wondered why plague doctors wore those bird-like masks with the long beaks, that was why. They stuffed the beak with aromatic substances to filter out the bad air, and probably also to avoid smelling the actual horror around them. But back to the rats. Medieval Europe was practically a spa resort for rats. Homes were warm, people stored food badly, and sanitation was more of a rumor than a practice. Rats thrived, and so did their fleas. The type most often blamed today is the oriental rat flea, Xenocilla chaopes, a tiny, blood-sucking insect with a serious attitude problem. When an infected flea bit a rat, the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, multiplied rapidly in the flea's gut. Eventually, the flea would starve, regurgitate the infected blood into its next victim, and thus, congratulations, you now have the plague, except no one knew that. All they knew was that shortly after the ships docked, people began dying. First slowly, then quickly, then constantly. It wasn't dramatic at first. A cough here, a shiver there. Someone had a bit of a fever. Someone else said they felt odd. Within days, though, the symptoms grew too large and too loud to ignore. But we'll get to the boils and the screaming shortly. The speed of spread was terrifying. From Sicily, the disease travelled north, to Genoa, then Pisa, and then inland to Florence, Venice, and beyond. Along the trade routes it flowed, following the roads, the carts, and the ever-wandering human desire to visit slightly different versions of the same market. Merchants carried it unknowingly, pilgrims carried it faithfully, soldiers carried it with grim efficiency, and cities welcomed it with all the grace of a sleeping guard dog. Interesting side note. In some parts of Italy, people tried lighting massive fires in the city centres, hoping to purify the air. This resulted in warm, smoky air, but unfortunately, the plague wasn't particularly afraid of bonfires. Elsewhere, people rang bells, banged pots, or marched in circles chanting psalms, all in the hope of scaring away whatever evil spirit had moved in. It didn't work, but it did provide neighbours with something else to stare at between funerals. By the time the plague reached France and England in 1348, it had already left a trail of confusion, panic, and shallow graves behind. Paris, a thriving medieval city full of smells and scholars, tried to maintain order until thousands began dying within weeks. London was next. It didn't help that the population density made rat control practically impossible. Even the countryside, once thought to be safe due to its isolation, fell quickly. The rats took the scenic route. It's easy to think of the plague as a single, massive wave, but it actually came in three main forms: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. Most people got the bubonic variety, marked by swelling lymph nodes, known as buboes. These painful lumps appeared in the armpits, neck, or groin, often turning black and oozing. We'll go into more detail about that next, so hold your nausea. The important point here is that no one could explain it, no one could stop it, and no one could outrun it. Rich, poor, educated, unlettered, all were equally vulnerable. The social hierarchy that had kept people in rigid roles for centuries began to wobble, not because of politics or revolution, but because the fleas didn't care who you were. They only cared if you had blood. Ports, once symbols of prosperity and connection, became gateways of death. Monasteries emptied, streets filled with the sound of mourning, and silence crept into places that had always been full of life. Cities tried quarantines. Some tried burning the clothes of the infected. Others just prayed harder. None of it made much difference. It's also worth mentioning that people began searching for scapegoats. Foreigners, Jews, lepers, stray animals. Anyone different or unlucky enough to be near an outbreak could be blamed. Some towns forced people to confess to imaginary crimes under torture, as if confession could cleanse the air. The panic didn't just kill. It fractured communities, deepened prejudices, and made the living fear the living as much as the dead. And still, the ships came. Trade couldn't stop, not completely. Food needed moving. Goods needed selling. And with every barrel of wine or bushel of grain came another opportunity for the plague to spread further inland. By 1350, it had reached as far as Scandinavia. The plague had no borders, no rules, no interest in your plans for next Tuesday. So there you are, standing in a town square, wondering why the baker hasn't opened, why the church bells keep ringing, and why the air feels wrong. You don't know about bacteria. You've never seen a microscope, but you know one thing for sure. Something has arrived. It's time now to talk about what happens next. What happens to the body, the mind, and the town when the Black Death sets in fully? When it's not just stories or distant ports anymore. When you see the first bubo. When you hear the first scream. Let's walk softly toward it. Let's say someone in your town has started to cough. It's not unusual. People cough all the time. From smoke, dust, cold air, or the general despair of medieval life. But this cough is different. It's sharp, wet. And then there's the fever, a heat behind the eyes, the kind that makes the skin ache and the mind wander. They stop eating, then they stop moving. And then, suddenly, they have lumps, painful, swelling lumps. These aren't ordinary swellings, like the ones you get from working too long or sleeping in the wrong position. These are buboes, the iconic sign of bubonic plague. Large, tender swellings that usually form in the groin, armpits, or neck. They're hot, red at first, and then, as the body begins to lose the fight, they turn dark, purplish, then black. Soft at first, then firm, then they begin to leak. They're often described in contemporary sources as fiery tumours, which is frankly a phrase no one should ever have to read over breakfast. The word bubo comes from the Greek bubon, meaning groin, which, if you think about it, is a rather undignified legacy for a medical term, but very on-brand for medieval Europe. Once the buboes appear, the clock starts ticking. There's a fever, of course, and a headache, and nausea, sometimes vomiting. Your body shakes, sweats, and then burns. The fever makes you delirious. You say strange things, forget your name, or shout at people who aren't there. In some cases, you lose control of your limbs. In others, your skin changes colour. Not just the buboes, but your fingers, toes, and nose may begin to blacken as blood vessels collapse. Hence the name, the Black Death. Though the term wasn't widely used until later, it likely stems from the dark blotches that spread across victims' skin in the later stages of the disease. It's not subtle, you can't ignore it, and you definitely can't hide it. People around you start to back away, not out of cruelty, but out of panic. Fear in the 14th century spread almost as fast as the plague. And once you show symptoms, most people assume the outcome is inevitable, which statistically it is. Without treatment, and remember there wasn't much treatment, the bubonic plague had a mortality rate of anywhere from 30 to 70%. And if it wasn't the bubonic strain, well, then it got worse. There was the septicemic variety. That one skips the buboes and goes straight for the bloodstream. Your blood thickens, your organs fail, and you die, often within 24 hours. Very efficient, very quiet, no visible symptoms until it's far too late. The upside? Fewer people ran from you because they didn't know you were sick. The downside? You were dead by morning. Then there's pneumonic plague. That's the one that affects the lungs. It spreads by coughing, talking, even breathing. No fleas required. This was the version that turned people's mouths dark with blood, made them cough violently, and filled the air with the sound of death on the move. Entire households fell within days. It was the kind of illness that made even priests stay outside the front door. Speaking of priests, if you were lucky, one might come to perform last rites. But during the worst of the plague, even the clergy fled. Whole churches stood silent. Bell towers were empty. No one was left to ring them, or no one was willing to go near the infected long enough to try. Interesting historical fact. Some towns hired plague confessors, people who would go house to house, offering blessings to those on the edge of death. But these confessors, bless their well-meaning hearts, didn't live long. The role became more of a revolving door than a lifelong vocation. And so people died at home, in beds, on floors, in the street. Sometimes with family, often without. Bodies piled up. There weren't enough grave diggers, not enough priests, not enough cloth to wrap the dead. In some towns, carts rolled down, the roads calling for the deceased. The infamous cry, "Bring out your dead." The symptoms weren't just physical. There were social symptoms too. If you looked sick, your neighbors might shut their doors. If your family fell ill, your friends might disappear. Fear pulled communities apart as much as the plague did. And yet, in some places, people cared for each other, even knowing what it might cost. Acts of kindness, mercy, and compassion, often buried under layers of horror, still emerged. Of course, there were plenty of superstitions surrounding symptoms. Some believed the swellings were the body's attempt to expel demons. Others thought it was divine punishment. Not for any specific sin, mind you, just general misbehavior. People would examine the boils for signs of prophecy, or wrap them in blessed linen, or burst them with hot knives. Spoiler: none of these methods worked particularly well. There are accounts of doctors attempting to balance the humours, which, as you might recall, was medieval Europe's favourite excuse for nearly every unpleasant thing. They would try bleeding patients, or apply leeches, or offer concoctions made of garlic, vinegar, and herbs. The goal? To draw out the poison. The result? Well, we'll cover that delightful chapter in the next section. Back to your average plague sufferer. Let's say you've got a fever, your armpits are swelling, and you're having disturbing dreams about rats. You know what's happening. Or rather, you feel what's happening. No one needs to tell you. You've seen it before, in your neighbour, your brother, the baker's daughter. You've watched the progression, from cough to confusion to collapse. And now, it's your turn. There's a strange sort of resignation that sets in. You might pray, you might weep, you might try to drink something strong and hope it works as a cure, or at least a distraction. But mostly, you lie still, listening, waiting. Outside, the town is quiet, quieter than it's ever been. The markets are closed. The bells ring at odd times. The birds don't sing as much. Even the dogs, who usually bark endlessly, seem to understand something is wrong. Your breathing slows. And then, let's pause here. Because what comes next? Well, it's not the end of the story. Not entirely. Because even as people fell, others kept living, kept working, kept trying strange remedies and attending stranger funerals. Which brings us neatly to the next part of our story. What did medieval medicine offer you? What miracle cures did they dream up in the shadow of disaster? Let's find out, slowly, gently, and from a safe distance. Let's talk about your options for survival. They aren't good. Once the plague arrived in town, medieval medicine stepped up with the full force of its 14th century creativity. And by full force, we mostly mean guesses. Well-intentioned, occasionally bizarre, and rarely helpful guesses. At the center of the medical scene were the physicians, the so-called professionals. These were the people with university training, usually in Latin, astrology, and Galen's outdated writings. Their treatments revolved around the humours, which were not, sadly, jokes, but rather the 4 bodily fluids believed to govern all health: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you were sick, one of these was probably out of balance. If you were dying, they would blame bile, or air, or the stars, but never themselves. So what did a medieval doctor do for the plague? Let's start with bloodletting. That was a classic. You show signs of illness, fever, pain, swelling, and the first instinct is to drain some blood. The logic was simple. Too much blood, chaco, bad. Less blood, less bad. The reality, of course, was more complex, especially when the patient fainted or bled too much. But hey, it felt like action. Another favourite? Leeches. Tiny, squirmy, medically respected parasites. Place a few on the skin, let them nibble at your blood, and hope that they knew what they were doing. Some people genuinely swore by them, others swore at them, which was more relatable. Either way, they were a popular prescription, especially when paired with the phrase, "Let's balance your humours." Then there were the herbal remedies. Garlic, onion, vinegar, and rosewater were popular ingredients. A common belief was that strong smells could protect you from miasma, the dreaded bad air that was thought to cause illness. So you'd be encouraged to chew cloves, bathe in vinegar, or rub your feet with crushed onions. One recipe involved baking onions with butter, applying them to the buboes, and then hoping for divine intervention. If nothing else, it made you harder to sit near. The truly ambitious might seek out crushed gemstones, emeralds, sapphires, even pearls. These were ground into powders and consumed, usually by those rich enough to afford something completely useless. Emeralds, in particular, were thought to draw out poisons. Unfortunately, they mostly drew out your wealth and your remaining hope. Another remedy involved live chickens. Yes, chickens. Physicians advised strapping a chicken, specifically its backside, to the swellings, believing that the bird would draw out the disease. If the chicken died, that was a good sign. For you, not the chicken. If the chicken survived, they might try again with another bird. One can only imagine the chicken's opinion on this process, which likely included a lot of clucking and none of it flattering. But not all efforts were quite so dramatic. Some people just tried to stay clean. Cleanliness was, by medieval standards, unusual. Many doctors began recommending frequent hand washing, bathing when possible, and avoiding foul smells. Homes were fumigated with juniper, rosemary, and frankincense, not because they killed bacteria, no one knew what bacteria was, but because they smelled better than rotting bodies and damp straw. And then there was the plague doctor, that iconic, strange figure in the long cloak, wide-brimmed hat, and terrifying bird-like mask. Stuffed into the beak of the mask were herbs, spices, or dried flowers, intended to protect the wearer from bad air. The doctor's entire outfit was meant to be protective. Leather gloves, waxed coat, boots, a kind of medieval hazmat suit. Now here's the twist. Those plague doctor outfits weren't commonly used during the first wave of the Black Death in the 1340s. They became standard much later, particularly in the 17th century during later outbreaks. So while the image is famous, it's more of a historical mashup than a direct snapshot. That said, it's still fun to imagine these bird-headed physicians waddling around a medieval town, waving long sticks to prod patients without getting too close. And if you weren't into doctors, there was always faith. Many believed the plague was divine punishment for pride, greed, sin, or possibly just existing at the wrong time. Some towns organized flagellant processions, where groups of people marched from village to village, whipping themselves to show repentance and beg for mercy. They chanted, wept, and bled, and often ended up spreading the disease further with all that traveling and bleeding. Meanwhile, the wealthy fled to their countryside estates, out of reach, out of breath, and definitely out of town. Those who could afford to leave did so early, locking the gates behind them. Those left behind, told to pray harder. Some doctors encouraged people to stay cheerful, because fear, they believed, could weaken the body. Others advised avoiding sad stories, bad smells, and loud noises, essentially inventing the wellness blog centuries early. Avoid stress, they'd say, while a funeral procession passed outside the window. And still, the plague kept coming. Interesting fact. One Venetian doctor suggested quarantine, a word that comes from 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Ships arriving in port were held offshore for 40 days to ensure no one was sick. It was one of the few approaches that actually worked. Eventually, cities across Europe adopted versions of quarantine, locking down infected households or entire districts. Doors were marked, guards were posted, and people either waited out the plague or didn't. But for the average person, the poor peasant, the overworked artisan, the tired mother, medicine offered little more than fear wrapped in herbs. You might see a doctor once, or never. You might rely on your local healer, your grandmother's wisdom, or your own creative desperation. You tried everything: wine-soaked bandages, garlic necklaces, sleeping with your feet pointed toward the sunrise. Some burned aromatic herbs, others burned their neighbors, convinced they were witches. Cities turned on outsiders. Strangers were driven out. Cats were killed, dogs abandoned, wells were feared. Every cure came with suspicion. Every solution came too late. And yet, people kept hoping. kept trying. They saved each other when they could. They lit candles. They left coins on doorsteps. They whispered prayers into the night air thick with silence and smoke. Some survived. Many didn't. But through it all, medieval medicine tried, earnestly, oddly, and with leeches. And now, as the smells fade and the last of the vinegar rinses away, we turn toward the next part of this strange, unsettling journey. Let's talk about what happens when all else fails. When the doctor's gone, the prayers are done, and all that's left is death. By now, the onions have rotted, the leeches have slithered off, and the garlicky prayers have gone unanswered. It's no longer about recovery. It's about what to do with the bodies. And oh, the bodies. At the height of the Black Death, death wasn't some far-off concern. It was immediate, constant, and piling up, literally. In normal times, medieval burials were modest but meaningful. A priest, a grave, a few relatives, and some final words spoken over a carefully wrapped body. The church took great care in these moments. Death was sacred, a rite of passage, an introduction to eternity. During the plague, death became logistics. Gravediggers, once humble and unnoticed, suddenly became the busiest people in town. They worked sun up to sundown, digging pits that grew wider each day. But soon, even they began dying. There weren't enough people left to bury the dead, and so the task fell to whomever remained. Young boys, old men, desperate volunteers, and often no one at all. Bodies were dragged through the streets in carts. Not elegant wagons, just wooden handcarts pulled by neighbours with torn sleeves and weary eyes. If you were lucky, someone covered your face with a cloth. If you were really lucky, someone remembered your name. Church bells rang endlessly. At first, they tolled for the dead, one chime per soul. Then they tolled for entire households. Then they tolled without pause, a background hum of grief and desperation. In some towns, they eventually stopped, ringing entirely because there was no one left to ring them. Priests ran out of holy water. Funeral rites were shortened. Often there was no time for prayer at all. Bodies were buried as quickly as possible, sometimes 2 or 3 deep in one grave. In cities like Avignon, Florence, and London, entire plague pits were dug. Massive communal graves hastily lined and filled, covered over before the next wave arrived. Interesting fact, many of these plague pits are still being uncovered today by archaeologists. In London, for example, workers digging for subway expansions in the 1980s and 2010s discovered mass graves filled with plague victims, tightly packed, laid shoulder to shoulder, and remarkably well preserved thanks to centuries of clay and silence. These discoveries serve as quiet reminders of the scale of death that swept across medieval Europe. Back then, graveyards filled up in days. Families couldn't afford headstones. The dead were often dumped without ceremony, wrapped in whatever cloth was handy, or not at all. Entire parishes were overwhelmed. Some towns dug trenches outside, the walls, and pushed carts over the edge. What once was a sacred act became necessity. And what of the caretakers? The ones who stayed behind to do the burying? Many believed they were doing holy work, ushering the dead into the afterlife, even if hastily. Others took up the shovel out of desperation, for a few coins, a piece of bread, or the faint hope of protection through labour. Some gravediggers wore crude masks soaked in vinegar. Others wore nothing but tattered clothing and a prayer under their breath. As the death toll rose, superstition grew. People believed the dead could infect the living even after burial. Some tried burning bodies, which led to terrible smells and unintended fires. Others sealed homes with lime, trying to purify spaces where the dead had lain. Still others threw bodies in rivers, hoping the current would carry away the danger. It didn't. Some towns even outlawed mourning in public, fearing that emotional displays might spread panic. Grief became a private affair, if anyone had the energy left to grieve at all. And yet, for all the chaos, there were moments of remarkable humanity. Neighbours carried neighbours. Children tried to bury parents. Strangers lit candles for souls they did not know. In Siena, Italy, chroniclers noted that no bells tolled, and nobody wept no matter what their loss, because almost everyone expected death. And still, someone wrote that down. In ink, by candlelight with ash floating in the air. Because even as the world fell apart, someone cared enough to record it. You'd think the rich would fare better. Sometimes they did, escaping to countryside villas, locking their doors, bringing their own priests. But death doesn't care for income brackets. The Black Death crossed boundaries. Castles, convents, monasteries. No place was safe. Nobles died in beds stuffed with goose feathers. Peasants died on floors made of packed earth. All were buried quickly, quietly, and equally forgotten. With death everywhere, even fashion changed. People began wearing death tokens, amulets, charms, bones. Some wore sprigs of herbs around their necks, not just for the smell, but for the symbolism. "Memento mori," they whispered. "Remember you must die." The streets echoed with the sound of wheels on cobblestone, of weeping, of bells, of silence. At night, towns went dark. Doors stayed shut. Candles flickered in windows where entire families had once gathered. In some places, wolves entered cities, feeding on the unattended remains. The line between town and wild blurred. Civilization retreated inch by inch behind bolted shutters and prayers. And what of the living? They tried to keep their distance, which is difficult when you live in a one-room home with 7 relatives and one shared spoon. Entire households vanished in days. Children were left without parents. Parents buried children with trembling hands and no priest to guide them. Dogs roamed free. Crows grew fat. You couldn't tell who was sick and who was scared. Everyone coughed. Everyone looked pale. Was it the plague or just the anxiety of waiting for it? And still, the carts rolled. Interesting fact. Because of the speed of infection, many cities passed emergency burial laws. Florence, for example, limited funeral attendees to 5 people, an early version of social distancing at funerals. That is, if you even had 5 people left. By the end of the first major outbreak, it's estimated that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population had died. That's not a typo. That's not hyperbole. That's half of everyone, gone in less than a decade. No wonder the bells stopped. And now, as the graves grow quiet, as the sun sets behind 1,000 abandoned farmhouses and shuttered town squares, we step gently into what comes next. What happens when you return home and nothing is left? When your loved ones are gone? When the fear has moved indoors? At first, the fear is public. Shouts in the street, church bells ringing, carts of bodies trundling past with no destination but the nearest pit. But soon, the fear comes home. And it doesn't knock. It seeps under doors, clings to bedding, and curls up at the foot of the family hearth like an unwanted cat. You start to wonder if the people you love might be the ones who kill you. And that thought changes everything. Your neighbor's door hasn't opened in 3 days. No sound, no smell. You know what that means, and you don't dare check. You remember when you used to share soup with them. Now you walk faster when passing their house. Inside your own home, things are quiet, too quiet. In a medieval household, silence usually meant someone was up to no good. A child sneaking bread, a piglet being chased, or a neighbor listening through the shutters. Now, it means someone has stopped coughing or stopped moving. Parents, overwhelmed with fear, start locking doors from the inside, not to keep dangers out, but to keep the infected in. Children are told not to approach, to stay away from their mothers, to sleep farther from their siblings. And when one person begins to sweat or wheeze or cry out from the pain of swelling lymph nodes, the whole house shifts into survival mode. Some people flee. Some disappear before the fever even breaks. There are chroniclers who describe entire families abandoning their sick relatives in locked rooms with nothing but a bucket and a prayer. Priests write of mothers who refuse to nurse their infants, of fathers who bury sons with sticks rather than shovels and touching nothing, of siblings who never speak again. And while it sounds heartless, it wasn't always cruelty. It was panic and exhaustion, and the brutal arithmetic of staying alive in a world where even your own child could become your end. Interesting fact, the Italian chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, in his preface to the Decameron, wrote of parents abandoning their own children and entire households being left to die alone, untended, uncared for. He wasn't exaggerating. He lived through the plague in Florence and described streets so deserted that many a brave man died without a soul beside him. Some coped with music. Dancing, bizarrely, became a common escape. In parts of Germany and France, dancing mania spread. People dancing in the streets for hours, or even days, as if movement could keep death away. Was it mass hysteria, spiritual expression, a last attempt at feeling alive? Maybe all three. Either way, the rhythm was fevered and the faces were hollow. Others turned to religion with fervor bordering on desperation. Flagellants, groups of people who marched through towns whipping themselves, appeared across Europe, hoping that pain might ward off divine punishment. They left blood trails on cobblestone, chanting prayers and warning of doom. Some towns welcomed them, others chased them away. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, families held silent vigils. If you stayed knowing that caring for your kin might mean joining them in death. If you left, you walked away from someone you loved, knowing you might never return. Either choice chipped away at the heart. Homes, once centers of warmth and comfort, even if smoky and cramped, became tight boxes of dread. No one wanted to breathe the same air. You covered your face with cloth soaked in vinegar. You burned herbs on the hearth, not for flavor but for fumigation. You stopped sharing food. You stopped hugging. If someone died during the night, you waited till morning to deal with it, unless you had to move the body to make room to sleep. One house in London, according to an old parish record, had 6 people living in a single room. 5 died in the course of a week. The last one to survive sealed the door, chalked a mark on the outside, and was never seen again. The house was boarded up and later burned. In cities like Paris, Florence, and Siena, entire blocks were abandoned. You'd wake up one morning to find your street quieter than usual. Shutters closed, no bread smells in the air, no dogs barking. Then you'd realize it wasn't just quiet, it was empty. And the fear didn't stop with humans. Cats and dogs were often blamed for spreading the disease. In London alone, over 40,000 dogs and 200,000 cats were killed in a misguided attempt at pest control. Ironically, those cats might have helped with the rats. But at the time, fear overruled logic. As the disease spread, the rhythm of life dissolved. Mealtimes were skipped, chores abandoned. Even gossip lost its bite. No one had the energy to be petty. Friends vanished, and no one asked where they went. Weddings were cancelled. Baptisms became rare. The only event that still happened with any regularity was death, and even that became quiet. Not solemn, just muted. The weeping stopped because it happened so often. There were no more tears to give. People began to whisper their grief, or ignore it altogether. Doors were locked not to keep others out, but to keep grief in. And yet, in small pockets, kindness flickered. A sister stayed by a brother's bed. A child tucked a blanket around a fading mother. A neighbor left food outside someone's door, even though they hadn't spoken in years. These were small rebellions against the fear, moments of humanity that no chronicler could fully capture. But they existed. In one account from a village outside Avignon, a midwife refused to flee, tending to women in childbirth while the plague burned around her. She buried more children than she delivered, but she stayed. Her name was never recorded, but her work lingered in memory long enough to be written down by someone who watched her walk from house to house with a basket of herbs and the weight of courage. Now, as we leave the home, changed, broken, strangely quiet, we step out into streets no longer bustling, but still holding echoes of lives lived quickly and lost even quicker. The silence was new, and it was loud. Once, the town square was a place of clamour. Butchers yelling prices, bakers slamming dough, children chasing chickens they absolutely weren't supposed to chase. The tanner shouted curses, the blacksmith laughed too loud, and a woman in the market always tried to sell you a fish that had clearly died last week. It was chaotic, smelly, and alive. But now, you wake, stretch, and listen. There's no bread cart, no priest's bell, no clatter of hooves or gossip over fences. The street outside is still, like it's holding its breath, too scared to exhale. Markets, once the beating heart of the town, are ghostly. The stalls are still there, wooden frames sagging, awnings torn by wind, a few dried turnips lingering like they too are waiting for someone to care. The vendors, gone, or dead, or locked inside, peeking out from behind shutters with eyes like frightened owls. If you need something, bread, candles, a new pair of shoes because the old ones disintegrated 3 winters ago, you'd better already have it. Shops are closed, not by law but by terror. Those that remain open operate strangely. A note on the door might read, "Place coin in bucket, take loaf, do not speak." Contactless delivery, medieval style. Starvation becomes its own plague. Not because the land stopped producing food entirely, though harvests suffer when half the farmers are dead, but because no one dares bring it into town. Carts rot in fields, oxen wander off, sacks of grain sit mildewing in barns while hungry stomachs groan behind bolted doors. Even the wealthy start to feel it. Their servants stop coming, their cooks fall ill, their gardens, left untended, offer only thorns and judgment. Interesting fact, during peak waves of the plague, some towns saw population drops of 50% or more. Entire professions vanished overnight. In England, there were places where no one remained to bake bread, mend shoes, or ring the church bell. The economy didn't collapse in a dramatic bang. It quietly withered, transaction by vanished transaction. People start wearing odd things. If you do have to go outside, say to check if the baker is still alive or if the town well has turned into a wishing hole, you cover up. Not with elegant masks or gloves, but with whatever feels protective. Onion slices tied to belts, herbs stuffed in pockets, a rag soaked in vinegar wrapped around the mouth and nose like the world's saddest fashion statement. Then come the charms, plague amulets clutched in sweaty hands. Some are religious, crosses, rosary beads, saint medals. Others, less so. People carry bones of saints, locks of hair, rabbit feet, bits of toads. One man in Germany swore by a hedgehog paw sewn into his hat. Another woman carried a dried eel for reasons no one questioned. Desperation, it turns out, is highly creative. And still, the silence grows. No one wants to talk. Conversation feels risky. What if you breathe wrong? What if they cough? Gossip, once the glue of medieval society, dries up. No one comments on whose sheep wandered off. No one flirts in doorways. No one laughs in taverns. The ale goes stale, and so does the mood. Doors are locked, not just at night, but always. Visitors are unwelcome, strangers met with scowls. Even familiar faces look strange when you haven't seen them in weeks, and when you're not sure whether they've buried someone recently. In some places, neighbors paint crosses or symbols on their doors. A white cloth signals sickness. A red mark warns others to stay away. Some towns put up quarantine signs, but more often, people simply don't need them. Instinct has already built invisible walls. Deliveries, if they happen at all, are a game of silent cooperation. A loaf of bread left on a doorstep, a note pinned with a nail, a coin tossed into a bowl of vinegar to cleanse it. You leave the goods, back away 5 paces, and nod. That's the new thank you. Even churches fall quiet. Bells don't ring unless it's to signal another death. Services are suspended. Sermons, if they happen, are shouted from a safe distance, and mostly involve telling people that sin did this. Processions vanish. Pilgrimages halt. Holy days become unmarked and uncelebrated. Priests either disappear into country homes or become part of the death toll themselves. In some cities, only 1 or 2 clergy remain, desperately performing last rites over fields of corpses. Others flee, taking their robes and their faith with them. And in the midst of this all-consuming silence, something strange begins to stir. A murmur in the distance, a chant. Footsteps. You peek out a crack in the shutter. Down the road comes a procession, not festive, not fun. Men and women, barefoot, marching slowly, rhythmically. Each carries a whip. Many are already bleeding. Their backs are marked with raw lines, and as they walk, they sing. It's not a song of joy, it's a dirge, a prayer, a cry to heaven. These are the flagellants, and they believe that pain will save them, that if they suffer enough, the plague will go away, that their blood might cleanse a land drowning in it. But that's for tomorrow's step on our slow, sleepless stroll through this very medieval mess. So now, as you tuck your nose under the scratchy blanket, safe from rats and distant bells, let the shutters close again. Let the streets stay silent. Let the last loaf of bread on the shelf remain yours. They arrive just after sunset. You hear them before you see them. Slow chanting, low and rhythmic, somewhere between a hymn and a dirge. Not the cheerful sound of minstrels, not the raucous call of travelling merchants. This is something else. You step to your window, careful not to make a sound. You're not alone. Other faces appear in other windows. Curtains shift. Doors stay shut. Down the road they come, barefoot, cloaked in linen, faces half covered, heads bowed. In a time when no one goes out unless absolutely necessary. And even then, only to yell, "Stay back!" from across a cart. These people are walking together, shoulder to shoulder, forming a slow river of silence and blood. Then you see the whips, leather straps, some knotted with metal, some barbed, some already stained dark. And they're not just carrying them, they're using them. With practiced rhythm, they stop, kneel, then rise, and lash themselves across the back. Once, twice, again. The sound is soft, but it carries. A wet, smacking noise. Flesh on flesh. Devotion by abrasion. These are the flagellants. They're not nobles. They're not priests. They're not particularly welcome. But here they are, a rolling penitential parade. And their mission is simple. Bleed for everyone's sins, and maybe the plague will stop. It's not a subtle message. Interesting fact. The flagellant movement began during earlier plagues, but it swelled dramatically during the Black Death. By the mid-14th century, thousands of people across Germany, the Low Countries, France, and parts of Central Europe had joined these bands. They believed the Black Death wasn't just a disease. It was divine punishment, and if the world was to be saved, someone had to take the beating. And since no one really trusted the clergy anymore, or the nobles, or the doctors with their flower-stuffed bird beaks, this was something they could do. Something real. Something painful. Each group had a leader, a kind of self-declared conductor of suffering. They followed strict routines, 40-day circuits, processions through towns and villages, public displays of flagellation, usually in the marketplace or church square, sometimes accompanied by chanting, sometimes by silence, always accompanied by blood. They wore simple clothes, tunics, hoods, some with red crosses stitched into the chest, and always the whip. The church, at least at first, wasn't sure what to do with them. Some priests welcomed them. Others looked on with deep suspicion. After all, this was a kind of spiritual vigilante group. No pope had called them, no bishop led them, and yet they claimed moral authority. Eventually, Pope Clement VI, yes, the one who tried to bless the air with incense to keep the plague away, condemned the movement. In 1349, he officially banned public flagellation, calling it heretical and dangerous, not because it didn't work, though it didn't, but because it had become too popular, too independent, too messy. There were rumors that some flagellants started preaching strange doctrines, that they refused to take sacraments from regular priests, that they stirred up more panic than peace, and occasionally that they made things worse. Still, they kept marching. Sometimes they were welcomed into towns with reverence. People knelt, cried, joined them, especially the poor, the frightened, the ones who had already buried too many. This felt like control, like purpose. Sometimes they were chased out, stones thrown, doors barred, whispers spread. They're the ones bringing the plague. After all, they travelled. They bled in public. They chanted things no one quite understood. You, watching from your window, don't know what to think. A part of you admires them. Another part aches just looking at them. There's something almost theatrical about the whole thing. They stop in the centre of town. The leader reads from a scroll, a warning, a plea. The group drops to its knees, begins to chant again, and then slowly, the whips rise, Crack, crack, crack. Blood dots the cobblestones. A chicken clucks nervously. Somewhere, a baby cries. The townspeople stay back. No one joins this time. A few leave small offerings: bread, dried apples, a skin of weak wine. The flagellants take none of it. They finish, stand, and move on. Their feet leave red prints behind them. And then, just like that, they're gone. No one speaks. The silence closes in again, but it feels different now. Less empty, more charged, as if their pain echoed in your bones. As if someone whispered, "Is this what it takes to make the gods listen?" Interesting fact, the flagellants not only performed acts of penance, they also held elaborate rituals. Some groups banned talking, laughing, bathing, or even sleeping on soft beds. They lived on bread and water, slept on straw, and timed their wounds carefully, ensuring they bled in unison, like spiritual choreography with bruises. Their message? The world is broken, God is angry, and someone has to bleed for it. And for a time, many believed them. Of course, the plague didn't stop. The whips didn't work, but the movement left its mark, not just on backs and cobblestones, but on the psyche of a people desperate for hope, or at least a distraction. Because when everything feels out of your hands, sometimes you grasp for the only thing left. Suffering you choose, instead of suffering that finds you. As night falls fully, you close your window. You wonder where they'll sleep, if they'll eat, if they'll die on the road, unremembered, but still bleeding. And you wonder what comes next. Because if the flagellants can't save you, maybe someone else will. Or maybe, just maybe, someone will find someone else to blame. Blame is a strange thing. It arrives faster than a cure, settles deeper than a cough, and spreads even more quickly than fleas. When people are afraid, they look for answers. And if none are satisfying, they look for someone to punish. Someone obvious, or convenient, or simply someone different. And so, with the plague sweeping across Europe, the finger-pointing begins. It doesn't matter that no one truly understands how the disease spreads. It doesn't matter that priests, nobles, beggars and bakers are all dying at roughly the same speed. People want reasons, and when logic fails, suspicion steps in, dressed in a torn robe, clutching a pitchfork and whispering, "It's them." And so it begins. The scapegoats. At first the muttering is low. Did you hear the beggar woman muttering outside the bakery? What was she saying? That leper. Have you seen how he walks past the well each morning? The neighbours don't come to church. Strange, don't you think? And worst of all, the Jews. They haven't been getting sick like us. Which, by the way, was sometimes true, but not because of witchcraft or dark rituals. Many Jewish communities practiced stricter hygiene laws, including frequent hand washing, and often lived in more isolated areas due to segregation and persecution. Fewer interactions meant fewer chances to catch the plague. But try explaining that to a terrified crowd with torches and a dead mayor. Interesting and deeply tragic. Historical fact. During the Black Death, over 200 Jewish communities across Europe were wiped out, not by the disease itself, but by angry mobs. In places like Strasbourg, entire populations were burned alive in their own neighborhoods. In Mainz and Cologne, communities were attacked, survivors were expelled. Some cities offered protection, others offered weapons to the mob. The accusations were bizarre and imaginative. Poisoning wells, summoning demons, spreading plague dust, which wasn't even a real thing. None of it held up under scrutiny, but no one was holding court anymore. Justice was replaced by rumor and fire. It wasn't just Jews. Lepers, people already shunned for a disease no one understood, were accused of deliberately spreading plague. Their bandages, their open sores, their very presence made people uneasy. So they were killed, or cast out, or relocated to somewhere conveniently distant, like a cliff. Beggars, foreign travelers, people with accents, people with too many cats, people with too few. Anyone could be seen as suspicious. The further someone lived from the center of town, or the more unusual their habits, the greater the chance they'd be blamed when someone's cousin developed a fever. You might be wondering, were there any trials? Not really. Or if there were, They were the medieval equivalent of a shrug and a scream. In many cases, victims were tortured until they confessed. And, as you might expect, people in great pain often say exactly what their torturers want to hear. In one account from Geneva, officials discovered a conspiracy to poison the city's wells, involving lepers, Jews, and Saracens. The logic behind this unholy alliance? None. But once a theory catches flame, it needs no oxygen. Even the authorities weren't immune to this paranoia. Kings and councils issued proclamations trying to stop the massacres, but also sometimes issued proclamations confirming the poison rumors. It was a choose-your-own-nightmare kind of situation. There's a quiet, awful irony in it all. During a time when people most needed community, they tore it apart. During a time when suffering was shared, empathy vanished. The very thing that might have brought people together, collective survival, became the excuse for collective cruelty. And yet, life continued. Markets reopened. Some towns welcomed new settlers, mostly because they had no one left. And the scapegoats, the ones who survived, moved further into the shadows, or fled entirely, or learned how to keep their heads down, lower than before. Perhaps you, watching this unfold, keep your door locked a little longer. Perhaps you speak a little more softly in public. Perhaps you check twice before offering help, wondering if it'll be misunderstood. It's no longer just disease that frightens you. It's the neighbors too. What's most exhausting is how unpredictable it all is. One day your neighbor's weeping about his cousin dying. The next, he's organizing a crowd to burn someone else's door down. You don't know who to trust, and frankly, you're not sure you even trust yourself anymore. Interesting fact, the word scapegoat itself comes from an older tradition, a ritual in which one goat was symbolically burdened with a community's sins and driven into the wilderness. During the Black Death, people weren't so kind. They didn't send their goats into the woods. They set the whole village on fire. The fear is understandable. The actions, less so. As we drift through this time, quietly now, it's easy to feel the weight of those misdirected blames. You can almost hear the shouts, smell the smoke, feel the tension ripple through a town that used to laugh at market day arguments and now glares at anyone who coughs. And still, the plague doesn't stop. Maybe that's the worst part. After the mobs quiet down, after the streets are stained and the whispers dry up, after the scapegoats are gone, the deaths keep coming. The boils still rise. The bells still toll, because it was never about them. But now, it's too late for some to realize that. And so we move gently forward, from the torches to the trembling candles, from fury to fragile faith, to ask what's left, when the churches are full of silence and the priests are missing. Faith is a quiet thing, until it's not. In peaceful times, faith lives in the rhythm of bells, the scent of incense, and the low hum of familiar prayers. It's built into your life. Morning mass, Sunday rituals, saints for every mood. You nod to a priest in passing. You cross yourself at a crossroads. You whisper to the Virgin when the crops look sick. You believe, because it's what you do. And then the world starts dying, loudly and without explanation. At first, people turn more toward God. It's instinct. The plague arrives, and suddenly, prayers multiply like fleas. People clutch relics. They light candles until churches glow like beehives. Everyone's searching the heavens for some celestial explanation. Surely there must be a reason. Surely, if we kneel low enough, if we whip ourselves hard enough, if we chant long enough, we'll be spared. Some priests embrace that mission. They stay. They walk among the sick, offering last rites by lamplight, barely flinching when the black swellings appear. They bury bodies in rows, their voices hoarse from blessing the dead. They tell families the pain is part of God's plan. They comfort the grieving even as their own hands shake. It's hard to say whether that's bravery, faith, or just duty worn so deep it can't be removed, like mud on an old boot. Interesting fact. Among the most faithful were mendicant friars, especially Franciscans, who lived simply and served the poor. Many of them died in alarming numbers, not because they had to, but because they chose to stay when others left. They believed in service, even when it meant coughing through prayers. Of course, not everyone stays. Some priests quietly vanish. Bishops retreat to countryside villas. Monasteries bolt their doors. Churches close not just for the plague, but from fear. There are stories, whispered of course, about clergymen locking out their own parishioners, about monks burning incense not for ritual, but to mask the scent of rot, and sermons, when they happen, grow darker. The plague is punishment, they say, for sin, for pride, for the way you let your chickens wander on the Sabbath, for vanity, for wine, for the neighbour who sings after curfew. It's hard to tell what's metaphor anymore and what's simply fear wearing a robe. The people listen, or they don't. They kneel, or they pace. Some beg forgiveness. Others stop coming altogether, because faith, when tested, can bend in any direction. For some, this is the end of belief. They've seen too much death, heard too many empty promises. The relic didn't protect their child. The holy water didn't stop the fever. The priest who said God sees all didn't see the plague cart coming. For others, faith becomes more desperate, not less. They light more candles. They walk barefoot to distant shrines. They create new rituals on the fly, pulling pieces from scripture, folklore, and sheer hope. Some even start their own cults, inventing prayers that mix Latin and farm gossip in equal parts. And in the quiet corners of empty churches, some simply sit, not praying, not weeping, just sitting, listening, to the silence where a choir used to be, to the hollow echo of boots where children used to giggle, to the ticking of time, slower now. Sometimes, a breeze rattles the stained glass. That feels like a sign. Sometimes, a rat scurries across the altar. That feels like a bigger sign. The candles keep burning, but the pews remain empty. You walk past one of these churches on your way to fetch water. You glance inside, and for a moment, you remember what it used to be. Full of light, of song, of community. Now it smells like dust and old promises. Faith hasn't vanished. It's just quieter now. God, if he's still listening, doesn't seem to be in the business of explanations. There's a strange comfort in that. If no one understands, then at least you're not alone in confusion. People begin to create small altars in their homes. A token of Saint Sebastian here. A holy ribbon there. A pebble that feels lucky, tucked into a pocket. New saints are whispered into existence. Unofficial ones for headaches, boils, and bad dreams. They're not in any Bible, but they feel useful. You say a quick prayer before sleep, not sure to whom anymore. Maybe just to something bigger than rats. And then you dream of old bells ringing in the distance. The sound stretched out, softer than before, like a lullaby wrapped in soot. That's the thing about faith. It changes. It mutates just as quickly as any plague. It doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it hides, or reshapes, or returns in unfamiliar robes. In time, some churches reopen. Some priests re-emerge, thinner and quieter. The services resume, though with more empty seats. The hymns feel slower, the sermons more hesitant. But they speak again, not always of certainty, sometimes of mourning, of humility, of mystery. You sit in the back row one evening, watching the candlelight flicker on a wall that hasn't been scrubbed since summer. A child coughs nearby. No one flinches anymore. There's a strange peace in the shared ache. You don't know if the plague will end, but you know you'll wake up tomorrow, cross yourself out of habit, and whisper a thank you for surviving one more day, even if you're not sure who's listening. And so, with the bells tolling softly in the background and the incense curling upward like tired prayers, we take one last look at the world that tried to hold on to belief when the sky seemed empty. Because what comes next isn't a miracle. It's survival. And survival changes everything. When the plague finally loosens its grip, it doesn't leave a celebration in its wake. There are no street parties, no dancing in the rain, no medieval equivalents of "we made it" banners. Instead, there's quiet, a long, cautious quiet. Because the Black Death didn't exit politely. It slunk away with a suspicious cough and the promise that it might be back later. And often, it was. But let's focus for now on the survivors. You wake up one morning, surprised to still be breathing. Outside, the bells are silent. No carts of bodies, no priests coughing themselves hoarse, just birds' song, which is unsettling. You haven't heard birds in weeks. You step outside and look around. The streets are empty, again, but in a different way. Less panic, more absence. The baker's stall is closed, forever. The cobbler's shop, shuttered, sandals still hanging in the window. You realize something very strange. You're alone in your neighborhood, alone and unemployed. Roughly 1/3 of Europe's population is gone. In some towns, it's half. In a few, everyone. Entire villages vanish. Farmland returns to wildflowers. Cats outnumber people. There's a sense that the map itself has shifted. Not from new borders, but from blank spaces. But amid the grief, something new creeps in. A weird, unfamiliar feeling. Not joy, certainly, but possibility. Because now, for the first time, you matter. A little. You, the laborer, the shepherd, the servant. You, who was once invisible. Now, you're essential. The Lord's fields need ploughing, but there's no one left to do it. You, the surviving tenant, can name your price. Interesting fact, in the aftermath of the Black Death, wages for labourers actually rose, not out of kindness but scarcity. The powerful needed the poor, and the poor knew it. You don't exactly become wealthy. This isn't a rags to riches tale, but you get options. Maybe you leave the village to find better pay. Maybe you refuse to do corvée labour for free anymore. Maybe, and this is wild, you buy meat more than once a month. The aristocracy, of course, hates this. Laws are passed to cap wages, to tie peasants to the land, to make sure this strange new confidence doesn't spread. But it does, slowly, like mould on hard cheese. Quietly, like a rumour whispered in a tavern. It spreads. And about 40 years later, the peasants revolt. Across England, in particular, the labouring class rises up. They've had enough of taxes, of lords, of being stepped on. They march on London. They demand change. It doesn't go well in the end, but the message is sent. The world has shifted. Society itself begins to rearrange, not overnight, not cleanly, but undeniably. Feudalism cracks ever so slightly. Serfdom begins its long, slow crumble. The gears of social mobility, rusty, squeaky, begin to turn. Of course, change also brings confusion. Land is abandoned, institutions weakened, entire families vanish, and with them, knowledge. Who owns that field now? Who tends the mill? Where's the village priest? You might find yourself promoted to miller because you're the only one who's seen grain before. There's also, curiously, more room, quite literally, in homes, in shops, even in cities. Orphans inherit land. Women run businesses after their husbands die. Guilds accept new members to replace the old. The rigid structures of the old world warp under the weight of absence. Scarcity, it turns out, is strangely fertile. Architecture changes too. So many buildings were left unfinished. New ones are built with more light, more air, as if people now need to see the sky. Cemeteries expand, some marked only by uneven rows of stones. But people plant flowers there. They remember, or try to. Art gets darker. Religious paintings show more skulls, more judgment, more fire, but also more angels, more tenderness. It's like the artist can't decide if they're angry or grateful. And underneath it all, a strange undercurrent of guilt. Why did you survive when your brother didn't? Why is your street still standing when the next village vanished? You don't have answers. No one does. But you carry that silence with you, a kind of invisible inheritance. Still, you go on. You plant seeds. You patch your roof. You tell stories of the plague to your children. Quietly, at night, when the fire's low and you're not sure if they're still awake. You keep a pouch of herbs near the door just in case. Interesting fact, even decades after the initial waves of the plague, people still wore amulets, charms, and carried aromatic herbs as protection, a kind of social memory embedded in fabric and folklore. The plague would return in waves over the next centuries. It never fully vanished, but it never again hit quite so hard, quite so suddenly, quite so universally. The first wave left a mark, not just in cemeteries, but in laws, customs, architecture, even dreams. You sometimes dream of the before times, of crowded streets, of loud markets, of sharing bread without fear. And then you wake up in the after times, quiet, sparse, different, and yet alive. Not everyone can say that. So you rise, you stretch, you sweep the threshold. You nod toward the road where carts once passed and bells once rang. You take a breath. There is grief, yes, and change, and something just beginning to grow. And with that, let's take one last look at the strange, weary faces of those who made it through. The survivors not just of a plague, but of a world remade. You survived, somehow. You're not entirely sure how, and neither is anyone else really. You didn't have fancy herbs, you didn't live in a tower, and the closest you got to a medical expert was a monk with a nosebleed. But you're still here. And yet, survival doesn't come with a parade. There's no joy in stepping over the ghosts of neighbors, or walking past the boarded homes of those you used to greet. You've lived. But what does that mean when so much else didn't? The world has shifted, and the silence it left behind isn't peaceful. It's heavy. Mourning, in the years after the plague, isn't loud and dramatic. It's quiet, lingering, worn like a second tunic beneath your clothing. People speak more softly now. They pause before telling jokes. And when someone says, "Do you remember?" there's always a moment of hesitation. Because yes, you do remember. All too well. Grief is woven into the routine. Not just the sadness of loss, but the confusion of continued existence. Why did one child recover, and the other didn't? Why did one village thrive, while another was reduced to ruins? You don't have an answer, but the question settles deep in your bones. And you carry it with you like a memory no one wants, but no one forgets. Dreams, especially, have changed. You close your eyes and see streets filled with flickering candles, or doorways marked with black crosses, or fields with more stones than crops. Some people see visions of death personified, not terrifying, but familiar, like a traveling companion who walked beside you and simply chose for now to keep going. Interesting fact, after the plague, many survivors reported vivid and unsettling dreams. Some chalked it up to trauma, others to divine messages. It became common to blame sleeplessness and nightmares on spiritual unrest. The world of dreams was seen as a thin veil, where the living brushed shoulders with the departed. And in art, that veil was painted in vivid strokes. Enter the danse macabre, the dance of death. It begins to appear in murals, woodcuts, and manuscripts. You'd see it on church walls, in city halls, and even on tapestries. The image was simple but striking. Death, often a skeleton, leading people of all classes, kings, merchants, peasants, priests, in a procession. No one was spared. Rich or poor, holy or not, everyone dances in the end. It wasn't meant to frighten, not exactly. It was more like a grim joke, a reminder, a way of saying, we're all in this together, and out of it together too. And perhaps, strangely, it brought a bit of comfort. If death didn't discriminate, then neither should life. Art and writing in general turned darker during this period. Gone are the romantic tales of courtly love and noble quests. Now it's more likely to be poems about weeping or woodcuts of graveyards. Even church sermons become bleaker. Priests who survived the plague are changed men, preaching fire and consequence with renewed intensity. And those new to the role carry a haunted look in their eyes, like they've been handed a broken world and a bucket of glue. But even amid the grief, people rebuild. Slowly, a new child is born, and neighbors gather, cautiously, to celebrate. A field is ploughed again. A church reopens, its bells quieter now, but still ringing. Markets return. Songs are sung, albeit more in minor keys. Life, however battered, refuses to quit. Still, grief lingers in strange ways. Some survivors develop superstitions, new ones to go with the old. A certain type of cloud, a breeze from the east, a sneeze before breakfast. These things suddenly seem dangerous, and who can blame them? They lived through a time when death came out of nowhere and logic was no shield. Others carry guilt. Why me? Why not him? Some say they hear voices at night, not ghostly, but familiar. A loved one's laugh in the wind, or the creak of a mother's stool by the hearth. They don't talk about it much, but everyone has their story. Interesting fact: in some towns, rituals developed for honoring the unnamed dead. Simple ceremonies where the living would walk silently through fields or hold moments of reflection at sunset. These weren't official church events. They were community acts of healing, half prayer, half memory. Clothing changes too. Mourning wear becomes more elaborate. Blacks and greys are favoured even for ordinary days. Jewellery is engraved with skulls or hourglasses, not in a creepy way, but as a kind of portable philosophy. A daily reminder: life is short, fragile, and worthy of being noticed. Some people become more religious. Others turn away from faith entirely. Some drink more, some work harder. Some stop making plans longer than a week in advance. But gradually, the world begins to breathe again. New generations are born with no memory of the plague. They ask why Grandma keeps so many dried herbs over the door. They wonder why Grandpa stares out the window whenever he hears church bells. They don't understand why the adults pause before saying grace. And that too is part of survival. Because the scars of a pandemic, any pandemics, aren't just physical. They're cultural. They're passed down in stories, in habits, in lullabies that sound more like warnings. The Black Death didn't just kill millions. It reshaped how the survivors saw everything: time, health, God, neighbors, themselves. And maybe that's why we still talk about it centuries later. Not just because it was tragic, but because it was so deeply human. So full of fear, of loss, of love interrupted and laughter silenced. And yet also, somehow, full of stubborn hope. You might find a hand-carved token someone kept for luck, a letter from a monk thanking God for sparing his abbey, a child's doll buried next to a bowl of berries, little gestures that say, we kept going, we kept believing, we kept dancing, even when the music got strange. So if you were there, standing in that quiet morning after the worst had passed, you might not celebrate, but you'd know something true. You're still here. Somehow. And that for now is enough. Let's be honest now, just between us. You wouldn't have made it, and that's okay. You, with your daily vitamins and running water. You, with your fear of lukewarm takeout and your curated hand soaps. You, who has preferences about sock fabrics and considers a 15-minute Wi-Fi outage a minor personal crisis. The world of the Black Death would chew you up and spit you directly into a ditch outside the town walls, and it wouldn't even bother labeling the grave. You wake up in the 1300s, and the first thing that happens is probably an allergic reaction to the wool. Not dyed, not washed, not soft touch. Just itchy, scratchy, questionably alive wool. You take a deep breath and realize instantly that no, that's not rustic countryside air. That's the smell of dung, decay, desperation, and maybe onions. Ah yes, onions. Let's talk about those. Interesting fact, one of the most commonly suggested plague cures was simply tying raw onions around your neck, or garlic, or both. Depending on the town and the level of panic, you might be rubbing them on your chest, your doorframe, or your sick relatives. Why? Because they were thought to absorb the miasma, bad air. And after a few hours in a medieval house full of coughing, sweating, panicking people, you'd probably agree the air was bad. You, in your confusion and horror, might even try it. But let's face it, even if you avoided the onions, even if you somehow dodged the rats and sidestepped the boils, and that's a very big if, you'd still be in serious trouble. Because this wasn't just about medicine, or the lack of it. It was about how completely the structure of daily life collapsed. No groceries, no pharmacies, no hospitals as you know them. The doctor is a man with a stick and a bird mask, and he's quoting Aristotle while applying a poultice made of tree sap, crushed pearls, and pigeon guts. He charges half your family's grain stores. He also probably dies a few days later. Water? If it's not muddy, you're lucky. Food? You eat what hasn't spoiled. Entertainment? Watching your neighbor shout at a cloud while wearing a necklace of garlic bulbs. Exercise? Walking 6 miles to find out if the next village still exists. It doesn't. There's no clean bedding, no 24-hour urgent care, no Google to tell you if it's just allergies or actual death. And let's not forget, no antibiotics, no antiseptics, no anesthesia. Stub your toe? Infection. Bad luck. Toothache? Too bad. Someone's cousin has pliers and strong arms. Get a fever. Everyone starts looking at you sideways. Then they leave you in a locked room and pray. Not for your recovery, but for your peaceful departure. Interesting fact, even kings and nobles weren't spared. The plague showed no interest in status. Monarchs, cardinals, scholars. The Black Death didn't care if you had a crown or a crust. In fact, some of the more opulent funerals resulted in massive public infections. The rich could flee to the countryside, but that didn't always help. The fleas were already on the road. And you wouldn't even get out of the city gates. You'd be that guy banging on the monastery door, asking if they have oat milk and Wi-Fi. Now, it's not your fault. Modern life has made you soft. You're used to apps, updates, and notifications. Your biggest exposure to medieval life is probably from a historical drama in which the peasants are unusually attractive and somehow clean despite farming all day. But this wasn't a story. This was survival. This was rationing stale bread and watching out for people who might turn you in for coughing. This was praying not because you're devout, but because it's the only thing left to do. This was carrying your sick brother to the edge of town and leaving him there with a jug of water and a whispered goodbye. This was trying to remember a lullaby for your child when the priest doesn't show up. This was death, yes, but it was also despair. Interesting fact. Despite the massive loss of life, many communities still maintained death records, wills, and local laws. Even in crisis, people tried to hold on to order, to write it all down, to pass something on. And that brings us to the final point. You wouldn't survive, but they did. Not all of them, no, not even most, but some. Enough. Enough to rebuild farms, enough to write new poems, enough to try again, and again, and again. So don't feel bad about your hypothetical, rather unfortunate fate. Take comfort in knowing that the human spirit, the messy, stubborn, onion-wearing human spirit, kept going. Not with grand speeches or heroism, but with quiet things, like feeding someone who can't eat, or burying someone who won't be remembered, or simply waking up and doing it all over again, hoping today is the day the bell doesn't ring. So now, we've seen it. The fear, the rot, the confusion, the rivers of garlic-scented hope, and the endless clanging bells of grief. And yet, they endured. Somehow. Not everyone. Not even most. But enough. Enough to keep burying, grieving, rebuilding, planting, marrying, and someday eventually laughing again. Not in great big parades of joy, but in small ways, quiet ways. Someone cracking a joke while hauling water. Someone planting onions, even though they didn't help last time. Someone carving a prayer into the wood of a bedpost, not to be heard, but to not feel forgotten. The world bent. Oh, did it bend? Under the weight of illness, of mourning, of confusion. Streets emptied, prayers thickened, answers thinned. But the world didn't break. Life continued, awkwardly, painfully, limping into the next century on unstable legs and smelling faintly of smoke and wild thyme. Those who survived found a new rhythm, one beat by one. No grand speeches, no brave last stands, just people existing. And that was enough. You see, history remembers the kings and the generals, but history is built on people who carried water and fed chickens and sewed torn cloaks and closed the eyes of the dying and dug the 1,000th grave without collapsing. It's not the grandeur that held us together. It was the quiet stubbornness of not giving up. Interesting fact. In the decades after the Black Death, the scarcity of labourers gave rise to a better negotiating position for peasants. One of the rare times in history when surviving made you economically valuable. This led to protests and reforms in various places, including the famous Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. But those are stories for another night. For now, it's enough to rest in the knowledge that humanity, lumpy, limping, garlic-scented humanity, came through, changed, scarred, but still here. Somehow, even as the world fell apart, someone still made soup. Someone still lit candles. Someone still looked at the stars and wondered if tomorrow might, possibly, hurt just a little less. And tonight, you don't have to flee the city, or bury your neighbor, or wear a hedgehog paw around your neck. You don't have to boil your shoes to eat them. You don't have to pretend crushed emerald dust is an acceptable ointment. You just have to sleep. Let the bells grow quiet. Let the doors close softly. Let the coughing fade. Let the streets clear, the fear subside, and the past rest where it belongs. You're warm now. You're safe. And the plague, that long, loud, terrifying chapter, can fade into silence while you drift away.